Hello everyone, this is a second video for the visualization of Ames Housing Dataset. Previously we looked at some simple visualization of categorical and numerical attributes using bar charts and histograms. This time we are going to explore some data reduction techniques and visualize them. First of all, let's look at what our data looks like. So this is our data. It has 11 dimensions. Some of it is categorical and some is numerical. So we'll first apply some data wrangling techniques such as fill the missing data, encode these categorical attributes into numerical ones, and try to normalize our data. This is an important step when you're doing data reduction. After applying all these techniques, this is how our data will look like. Now we have our data ready. We can now apply some sampling techniques so that we have different types of samples. We'll use two major sampling techniques. One is random sampling and other is stratified sampling. So random sampling is just taking a small percentage of your data, but for stratified sampling you'll have to apply a clustering first and then take appropriate amounts of percentages of those clusters. So to decide how many clusters we need, we'll use k-means clustering elbow method. This plot is basically between the number of clusters and the sum of squares of distances of all the points from their respective centroids. So to find the number of clusters, we basically look at the point after which the graph becomes sort of linear, and in our case 3 seems to be that point. So I'll take 3 as my number of clusters. Now we have our sampling done. We'll move to our first visualization, that is scree plot. So this is how a scree plot looks like. What we have done is we have done a principal component analysis of our data. So what that has done is we had 11 dimensions, so it has tried to project our data into different components. What PCA does, it tries to maximize the variability of the data, and it tries to encapsulate that into as less components as possible so that we could compress our data into less dimensions. So here, as we can see, the first component encapsulates about 42% of variance of our data. So our goal is to find the intrinsic dimensionality of our data using the scree plot. So as we can see, I have chosen 3 as my number of principal components, as it encapsulates almost 65% of our variance cap in the data. The choice in selecting the number of components is quite subjective. I could have easily chosen 4 or 5 dimensions as well. The ultimate goal is to capture as high as variance with as low as dimensions as you can. So 65% variance works for me, and the number of dimensions are less, so I'll choose 3 as my intrinsic dimensionality. We can also play with these options, and if we want to individually see how our scree plot looks for different data, we can choose here and compare between different combinations of the data. So if we visualize all 3 together, we can see they are almost overlapping on each other. So there's no bias introduced as such in this. This may happen because my data set is not too large. Sometimes it can happen that for small, for example, if the original data would have been much larger than the random sample data, there would have been some bias, because as small as the number of data points, so it will try to overestimate the value of these initial components. So moving on to our next visualization, now we have got our PCA vectors. We'll try to plot the first 2 principal components on a scatter plot. We do this because it is quite convenient to plot two dimensions on a 2D scale. Also, the first two components are capturing the most of part of the variance of the data, so it makes sense to plot these two together. You can see there are the points are colored in three different colors: red, green, and blue. These are the clusters that I obtained in the original k-means clustering of my data. So we can also play with random sample data. As you can see, the number of data points decrease, but the clusters are still maintained. So this shows that the PCA does a quite good job in maintaining the distances between the clusters. Similarly, for stratified sample, our clusters are still intact. So the next visualization we'll go is multidimensional scaling scatterplot using Euclidean distances. Multidimensional scaling is another technique for data reduction. The basic difference between PCA and MDS is that PCA tries to maximize the variability among the data, whereas MDS tries to preserve the pairwise distances between data points. One more thing is it is quite easier to confuse between PCA and clustering. We can remember it as like PCA tries to minimize the dimensions, whereas clustering tries to minimize the data points. So if we look at our MDS scatter plot, we'll see that the clusters are still maintained. However, they are a bit closer than they were in PCA. If you look at the random sample data, again we will see the clusters are maintained, but yes, their positions have changed. A similar thing can be seen in the stratified sample data. Moving on, so MDS multidimensional scaling can also be used with correlation distances, which we'll try to visualize here. As you can see, the green cluster is still maintained, but there is some overlap between the red and blue clusters using the correlation distance. This can be explained like as correlation distance doesn't necessarily follow the distance metric that Euclidean distance does. If we go to random sample data, again we'll see the same behavior between the red and blue clusters. Similarly for stratified sampling data. So we can maybe give a conclusion that using correlation distances doesn't gel much with clustering as does PCA or Euclidean MDS scatterplots does. The final visualization we are going to look at is the scatterplot matrix. So you'll wonder where these three attributes came from. Remember we did our scree plot visualization. There we found the top three attributes with the highest PCA loadings. So our intrinsic dimensionality was 3. So what I did was I summed the square of loadings for each attribute and found the top three attributes. So here we can see the plots between different combination of these attributes. As we'll notice that in the year sold versus month sold, the clusters are quite mixed. There may be a reason because the clustering that was done initially might not be on the basis of year sold and month sold, because our data will contain the data points for combination of almost all possible combinations of year sold and month sold. However, if we look at the plots between fireplace quality and year sold, or fireplace quality and month sold, we'll see that the clusters can be visible. Here is the red one, the blue one, and the green one is here. Similarly, in fireplace and year sold, you can see the clusters are quite separable. So you can draw a conclusion that the initial clusters that were formed might be on the basis of fireplace quality. So this is how scatter plot matrix helps us draw conclusions about the data as well. So these were the visualizations that we have encountered in this video for our data reduction. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks a lot.